Hey guys, we are back reading Black Marxism. We are on part 3 of the book. Very exciting. Part 3 is Black Radicalism and Marxist Theory, and then chapter 8, the formation of an intelligentsia. A little bit of housekeeping. I'm sorry that it's taking me so. Oh, you felt that? You heard that? It's taking me so long. I've been writing a script. So what I've been doing, because I've been reading just the book recently, well, yeah. And so what I've been doing is typing up summaries to be like, okay, so what does this mean? And then using the notes from my Black Thought class to like add in information. Porque it's more importante to understand what are we reading? You know what I mean? Because even when I first read this book for my class, I was like, what? What does this mean? What are you telling me? So it's really for me. So yeah, that's what I've been doing, writing a script. Almost done with that. So I will record and post those videos whenever. But anyways, let's just get started. The formation of an intelligentsia. It is not surprising that the appearance of a world revolutionary Black intelligentsia in the 20th century, rather than an issue of a longer process, might be presumed by most observers to be a phenomenon unique and specific to this century. Several quite easily identified reasons have contributed to this presumption. And okay, so let me just, I was about to, you saw my wheels turning, right? For one, as we have seen, the history of Black peoples have been recast consistently in both naive and perverse ways. Most particularly, the memory of Black rebelliousness to slavery and other forms of oppression have was systematically distorted and suppressed in the service of racialist, Eurocentric, and ruling class historiographies. The sum total was the dehumanizing of Blacks. The native responsiveness of these species was denied to African peoples. This distortion might have been a simpler matter if it had been merely a question of a gap occurring in the record, but the space had been filled with nonsense that was made credible by the conventions of racist thinking. For the unaware, nothing was amiss. It was this tangle to which the preceding chapters were addressed, and an attempt was made toward the achievement of a greater consciousness of the past of African peoples. The second basis for the misapprehension of the grounds upon which Black revolutionists had developed, however, was a different set of conventions in Western historiography. Certain habits respecting the framing of events, especially among scholars and the ideologues accustomed to assuming the existence of qualitatively distinct stages of human development, tended to trivialize or diminish the significance of precedents of two long-standing accounts. Enmeshed as they were in historical traditions, boasting of, say, Elizabethan or Edwardian eras, Jeffersonian or Jacksonian structures, and so on. Rather singular and often superficial benchmarks had become the rule for establishing the setting of human activity. Divisions of historical time seemed particularly easy things to recognize, attribute, distribute, and declare. To such intellects, then, the 20th century would seem a text in its own right. In a moment, we shall investigate how poor a preparation this would be for the proper placement of Black revolutionary thinkers. Finally, of course, there was the overpowering spectacle of European radicalism and revolution apparently launched by the First World War. No matter their ideological or theoretical legacy, liberal or otherwise, it seemed to some that these events were bound to the immediate forces that overtook the older capitalist order in the 20th century. Moreover, the names of the 20th century revolutionists, Zapata, Lenin, Trotsky, Gandhi, Mao, Fidel, Lumumba, Ho Chi Minh, Cabral, and many others, represented, what is that? Mercury in Scorpio sextiles Pluto and Capricorn. The last time this aspect happens with Pluto is in Capricorn for 248 years. The ground moves out from under our feet. Till this moment, I never knew myself. Purr. James Baldwin says, wait, someone said, do you consider yourself anti-capitalist? James Baldwin says, I suppose, to put it briefly, I would have to say that. I think capitalism costs the world too much. And he's not wrong. And he's not wrong. Because if you think about it, what if everything was free? And like, people, like, I like to work. I would work for kids, with kids, for free. I would be a mommy helper. I would babysit for free just because I like kids and I don't have to like give birth to them. Because like, first, I'm 22. I got time. But like, I'm thinking about, and never mind. Let's just keep reading. I apologize. Represented at the time more than Marx and Engels had anticipated in the 19th century, and much less. In any case, it was eminently obvious to them that Black revolutionary thought found its beginnings here. There was little cause to look elsewhere. In 1966, Eugene Genovese, I think that's how you're supposed to say it, the radical historian, neatly asserted all three propositions in an attack on the idea of a Black radical tradition in America. His comments reminded me of this movie that I watched. It was like Uncle Tom 2 on Tubi. Oh my god. It was something. American radicals have long been imprisoned by the pernicious notion that the masses are necessarily both good and revolutionary. This viewpoint now dominates the Black liberation movement, which has been fed for decades by white radical historians. And that's literally what the movie said. Like, it was like, these Marxists, these Black people that are revolutionary, they're being funded by white people. There's kids playing. I love the sound of kids playing. Anyways, decades by white radical historians who, in this one respect, have set the ideological pace for their liberal colleagues. It has become virtually sacrilege, or at least white chauvinism, to suggest that slavery was a social system within which whites and blacks lived in harmony as well as antagonism, that there was little evidence of massive organized opposition to the regime, that the blacks did not establish a revolutionary tradition of much significance, and that our main problem is to discover the reasons for the widespread accommodation and, perhaps more important, the long-term effects both of the accommodation and of that resistance which did occur. Thus, opposition to slavery was minimal. Who's crying? Is there a parent? Oh, they're good now. There's a parent too. I'm not nosy. Guys, it's a kid. If you hear a kid crying, what are you gonna do? Look? Ignore? Make sure the kid's okay? Right. Okay, that's what I thought. Okay, and then I see the parent down the street. Right. Excuse me. Thus, opposition to slavery was minimal. In the absence of extreme or weakness of such tradition, Black nationalism as a movement was a 20th century phenomenon, and the regard according to the revolutionary politics of the Black masses has its source in white radicalism. Girl, what? Anyways, in the present chapter, we will explore in detail the final thesis. This is what we're in the. You know, whenever you read a book and you're like, oh, this is the things that they're talking that are important. This is that sentence. Like, this is what the chapter will be exploring. The presumed relationship between Black radicalism and the European radical movement. It is by far the most important of these three propositions associated with the misconception of Black radicalism. Nevertheless, some attention to the habits of historical construction is warranted. It will prove a useful preliminary step, I believe, in our effort to recognize the continuity that exists between the Black rebellions of the previous centuries and the first articulations of a world revolutionary Black theory in the present century. Next is capitalism, imperialism, and the black middle classes. In chapter 6, because we were rehearsing events that assumed their shape not less than 100 years ago or so, years or so ago, our historical narrative worked, with the Western conventions of centuries as terms of periodization as a convenient scaffold. However, social processes, that is, historical developments, are neither the products of nor meaningfully framed by such evenly measured periodicities. The French historian Ferdinand Brudel, for one important instance, made this point by extending the 16th century, the historical moment of the dawning of the modern capitalist world in the West, much beyond its formal claim of 100 years. In a different manner, the Russian revolutionary Lenin Trotsky, just as opposite a figure for our subject here, had earlier confronted such facile assumptions by calling them out as forms of foreshortened. Oh my god, I looked this up yesterday. My phone's updating. Don't turn off. It's like something with God, I think. Is a belief which held by some. Oh, wait. Belief in the Christian doctrine of the millennium mentioned by the book of Revelations. And then theological doctrine. Chiliasm or millionairism. Is the belief that a Messiah will come and bring about a time of divine rule and widespread salvation. Here are some examples: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, often resurges during periods of social change or crisis. Oh, and you got Hitler in there. Ooh. Okay, is the belief that there will be a period of peace and righteousness on the earth associated with the second coming of Christ? Okay, Rudall understood that 100 years was sometimes too short a period to encompass historical processes. Trotsky was amused by the suggestions that human activity might end or begin with the endings and beginnings of centuries. The point is that the construction of periods of time is only a sort of catchment for events. Their limited utility, though, is often abused when we turn from the ordering of things like this before this, that. Install now. Sorry, I'm installing an update. Ordering of things, that is the chronological sequencing, to the order of things, that is the arrangement of their significances, meanings, and relations, increments of time contoured to abstract measure, rarely match the rhythms of human action. I got my tea and my coffee in the bag. It is important to bear this in mind as we seek to come to terms with the Black theorists whose writings and thoughts have appeared primarily in the 20th century. Their era began with the ending of slavery. They were, it might be said, the children of slaves. Oh, they're running their little scooters. So cute. So cute. Don't fall. The children of slaves. The phenomenology of slavery formed and informed them. And this is highlighting that continuity type of thing, rather than thinking of them as like that the 20th century, they're cut off from the 19th century or the 18th century. You know what I mean? It's like living in a multi-generational home. Like for my family, like me, I'm 22. My grandfather, he's 90. My nana, she's 89. She's going to turn 90 in November 16th. She's a Scorpio. Yes. But I'm not, like, you know that thing, oh, you exist in the context that came before you, blah, 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 blah. My grandparents, they are the context. My mom, she is the context that came before me. I'm informed by not only their experiences, but my mom's experiences, the people in my family, like things like that. I keep looking at myself instead of looking at the camera. I apologize. Anyways, in the vortex of its ending, more particularly in the wake of the social forces that compelled new and different situatings of blacks and others destined to serve as labor forces, these theorists discovered their shared social and intellectual location. The 20th century was for the most part their biographical station, but merely one site in the zone of their interrogation. Still, in the post-slavery world order that was their setting, the black ideologues who were to work in the 20th century could not be other than strangers. This was to be their lot in whatever part of the black world they were formed. C.R. James might have spoken for all of them when he wrote of the end of his school days. There was no world for which I was fitted least of all the one I was now to enter. In Africa and the West Indies, European empires and colonies were either being dramatically reshaped by the dictates of state and commerce or spawned at points formerly less accessible to capitalist expansion. In the United States and the Caribbean again, black peoples were no longer conveniently lodged in or organized by slave systems. The blacks of the New World could no longer be casually pinioned, I think that's how you say it, pinioned, Pinioned. I can't look it up because my phone is restarting. Yes. Woohoo. By the curious as slaves at the margins of such systems as free men. And inevitably, their societies and subcultures upon which the intelligentsia drew were steadily becoming less so I recorded this yesterday, but I didn't like it because it took too long, and I kept going off on my little tangents. So I'm re-recording it today. And I forgot how I was supposed to autochthonous. It means indigenous. Okay, so the word is I forgot how to pronounce it. That makes me so pressed. AUTOCHTHONOUS, meaning indigenous rather than migrant or immigrant or colonist. Yeah. So they're becoming more assimilated to. I'm falling off my bed. Ooh yeah. Ooh yeah. They're becoming more assimilated into, like, okay, right. Yeah, it means indigenous though. Becoming less indigenous. The social patterns, the habits of thoughts, language, and customs have been had congealed in the laborers' communities of the Western Hemisphere slave systems, though in many senses fundamentally conservative, were no longer as impervious to the penetrations of Western cultures as they had been in their native circumstances. The masses of black peoples in the New World and in their ancestral homelands as peasants, farmers, peons, agrarian workers, migrants and immigrant workers, domestic, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled industrial laborers, and as labor reserves now assumed more diverse and diffuse positions in the economic order. Black labor's new mobility, organization, and adaptability also meant that the subcultures within which it had been historically enveloped were subject more often to the intrusions of material and ideographic elements from the agents of the economically determinative social order. Though it might be correctly argued that much of this penetration was at first incidental, some of it clearly was not. Language, that is, the language and consciousness of rule in the ruling classes, was an instance of the latter. These accretions would have profound effects on the ideologues of the black world. Marx and Engels, if we recall, had once conceived the notion that the bourgeoisie of Western Europe would succeed in transforming the whole of the world's nations into bourgeoisie societies. Loci reduced to social orders of ruling and proletarian classes, as Marx declared in one of his prefaces in the first volume of Capital. Historically, however, capitalist expansion had as its result only the most approximate relation to Marx's projected social divisions. In those parts of the world where resourceful indigenous ruling classes were encountered by the empire builders, collisions were inevitable. Not as inevitable were the results. Some native elites were vanquished and destroyed, others not. Some, having led formidable anti-imperialist defenses, preserved much of their independent cultures, whittling down foreign influences to the mundane exchanges required by colonial administrations. Many, however, and it is within the British Empire that one finds the best examples, became part of the apparatus of indirect rule. That's why I had this book out, because we're going to talk about that. A system whose rationale could only be concisely put forth by one of its mechanics, the British anthropologist Marjorie Perham. The basic difficulty in carrying out indirect rule is one that will appear in its different aspects: education, land tenure, economic production, law, in all of our coming discussions. It is, and here I speak specifically of Africa, the great gap between the culture of the rulers and the ruled. In administration, reduced to its simplest terms, it means that for the most part the people do not understand what we want them to do. If they understand, do not want to do it. We endeavor to instruct the leaders of the people in the objects of our policy in the hope that they will, by their natural authority. I'm looking at you, so you know what I'm right. At once diffuse the instruction and exact the necessary obedience. Indirect rule. When you control a man's thinking, you don't have to control his thoughts because his actions, because his actions are going to align with the thinking that you indoctrinated him with. This indirect rule, think about, I had an example yesterday that was so good. Where is it now? Let me think. No, I'll just say that. Should we read this book too? I have a couple books that they're kind of short. Anyways, for a time, the collaboration of native elites was sufficient for the imperialist and colonial authorities. Wait, I'm trying to think of a good Booker T. Washington. That's who I will give as an example. He was like, oh, we need vocational training. I don't care that much about intellectual pursuits, your economic and political pursuits. Like, don't worry about that, black people. Why don't you worry about your vocational training for these white corporations? How about that? Yeah, you're gonna work for the white man. What book am I thinking about? I have my computer out because I'm gonna add more to my script today. Oops. Don't look at my password. Let me open this up. Okay. It's like The Education of Blacks in the South by James D. Anderson that speaks about this, like, miseducation of the Negro. Which is really interesting because public education was originally started within the black community, and then it was like taken over by white philanthropists that like wanted black labor, pretty much. It's a whole thing. Anyways, for a time, the collaboration. Where are my books? The Education of Blacks in the South from 1860 to 1935 by James D. Anderson. It's a really good book. At the peripheries of the world system where forms of coerced labor was obtained, peasantries existed in proximity to agrarian workers, unskilled labor workers, to semi-skilled workers. Labor reserves were directly and indirectly connected to those absorbed by the political instruments of authority, armies, militias, native police. By the last decade of the 19th century, however, social forces set loose by imperialist invasions, wars, occupations, administrations, and co-optations were maturing. In the middle tier of these societies rested the native petite bourgeoisie, wedged between the laboring classes beneath them and the foreign and native operatives of capital and the officials of the state above. Their social origins were complex and intertwined. One of their bases was the mulatto populations of the former slave societies and the colonies. This brown stratum was frequently the natural issue of racial systems where privilege of position and education was sometimes bestowed by white fathers, in parentheses, or mothers. In other instances, it was, and that, see how that's like that racial capitalism continue, like still developing type of thing. It's really interesting. Interesting, not like ooh, more like oh. Girl. In other instances, it was the result of deliberate political policy. In his massive study, Caste, Class, and Race, Oliver Cox stated the general rule: where whites where where whites were mainly sojourning rulers, their numbers were relatively small. Ordinarily, home is in Europe or America, and they seldom set their roots in the area. Here, there is little hope of developing a significant white population. The white man's principal need is not a home, but a satisfied and exploitable people to develop the resources of the country. The ruling class adopted a policy of cooperation, and other things being equal, favors are distributed to the mixed bloods on the basis of their apparent degrees of whiteness among the people of color. Degrees of color tend to become a determinant of status in a continuous social class gradient, with whites at its upper reaches. The lighter the complexion, the greater the economic and social opportunities. Colorism. I do believe that it's important for people that benefit from colorism to not internalize it, because it is racism. Colorism is a manifestation of racism, and when we internalize colorism, it is an internalizing self-hatred. Yeah. I've been getting my notes on the psychology of race and racism. So when I'm at one point, those notes will be available, and I can do a video on that topic because it was actually very interesting, and it validated a lot for me in terms, and the psychology of the Black experience, because it validated a lot for me in terms of my own experiences in high school, where like I didn't understand some stuff like I understood racism and colorism, of course. Like, I'm not stupid. I have grandparents and parents that were like, no, you know who you are, you know what the right. But it was more in like, I grew up in like a liberal area, so you know when like the racism is more implicit and implied, so you're kind of like, am I tripping right now? Was that racist? I felt like that was a little bit racist. What's going on? You know what I mean? So, anyways, it doesn't really matter. Another basis of the petite bourgeoisie was property. Some blacks, but certainly with less frequency than occurred with the French colonists termed the petite blancs, had translated particular skills, traditional positions, and knowledge into property, including slaves during the slave era. With slavery abolished, some of this black controlled capital was reconverted into professional skills in succeeding generations. Frequently, however, the native middle classes had been directly formed as functionaries of the state, civil servants, minor as well as middling, and as agents of landed mercantile or manufacturing capital, often absentee. And for sure, there were other paths leading to the privileges of the stratum, some less legitimate or conventional. For colonial administrators, however, the most problematic origins for the native petite bourgeoisie were the mission schools. From the 15th century and before, the missions had all along served as a part of the rationale for European colonist and imperialist aspirations. Still, the correspondence between the ends of missionary work and the goal of imperialism had never been entirely true. For one, the missionaries themselves, in the case of English imperialism, were often recruited from colonized peoples, that is, the Scots, Irish, and Welsh. Some soldiers for Christ could often be quite ambivalent about the colonial power. Just as troubling were the potential conflicts between faith and imperial interests. During the construction of slave systems and afterwards, the teaching of the tenets of Christian beliefs had taken as one of the presumptions the fact of the savage and the savage's or pagan's needs. Don't play with me. I need to save my work so it doesn't get deleted. It was thus axiomatic that the proof of the missionary success was the creation of civilized Christians. Civilized. Right. Natives whose familiarity with European or Euro-American cultures and habits were as intimate as their experiences with Christ. Flash it. This meant, though, that Christian missionaries were in some instances, that Christian missionaries in some instances felt some ambivalence towards such colonial policies as indirect rule, especially when it was held to involve the strengthening of animism or Islam. Animism is Islam. Animism is the belief that things have a spirit, that things are real. Like my plants, my babies are alive. They can hear you. They can hear me. That's like animism, the belief in like these things are alive. These things have a spirit. Another baby. I can't smoke weed when there's children. Just kidding. I mean, no, not just kidding. Kidding about weed. Anyways, as Victor Murray put it, most significant, however, were the attitudes colonial administrators developed toward the activities of the missions. The construction of Black Europeans was overly ambitious in their eyes. In 1938, Arthur Mayhew would advise an Oxford University summer session for colonial administrators that before the Great War, education was undoubtedly too literary. Too literary. Who does that sound like? Booker T. Washington. Hello. And he then reported with satisfaction that from 1925 onwards, great emphasis was laid on vocational training. Oh, Booker T. Washington. Damn, I fucking hate that man. 40 years later, Penelope Harrington would penetrate Mayhew's objections. In the past, missionaries had counted themselves successful if their work in the field of education had produced Black Englishmen, Africans who seemed to have assimilated to Western culture. Miss Girl. We've all been miseducated, especially if we live in the West. But these missionary educated Africans were it's like dislike, heavy dislike. I looked up this word yesterday too. Anathema. That's not how it's pronounced. Anathema. Anathema. How was that pronounced yesterday? Anyways, it's like a heavy dislike. To many administrators and others, they were cheeky and demanded social equality and political rights. It had become necessary to rationalize colonial policy and mission education. The formation, cool car. That's not Allie. The formation of native elites was to be more deliberate. In the beginning, there would be an appropriate contingent of clerks and a limited number of professionals. not nationalistic intellectuals in the West Indies. Such was the educational policy laid down generally at the end of the 19th century. In Africa, where populations were large and mission schools were relatively few, some policy was inaugurated in the years following World War I and a commonplace by the 1930s. In 1933, the report on African affairs read in part two especially important objectives have been kept in view in framing the educational policy of Nigeria. The first, to spread a sound education as widely as possible among the masses in order to produce, in a course of time, a literate population able to participate intelligently in the economic, social, and political development of the country. The second ideal is to train up as soon as may be a body of men and women who can perform some of the tasks in government work and private enterprise for which the first impact of Western civilization it is necessary to import Europeans. It soon became clear, however, that the colonial governments had moved too late. Elite nationalism, one of the first political expressions of the black petite bourgeoisie, was already propelling complements of the class into the older, more profound tradition of radicalism. Elliot Skinner would recall, by the 1920s and 30s, conflict and incoherence had spread into almost all aspects of life in colonial Africa. There appeared a group of Africans who had acquired the cultures of the colonizers and considered themselves to be British, French, and Portuguese. They have learned to consider Europe as home and had adopted European clothing, speech, and mannerisms. Such was the case in the Caribbean and in America, where the emergence of the middle class among blacks could easily be traced back to the 18th century. Even in independent Haiti, where the black and mulatto revolutionary armies had, by the beginning of the 19th century, broken down into racial and class factions, and petit bourgeois nationalism found expression. The sugar export sector of the Haitian economy had been destroyed during the Revolutionary Wars and subsequently was unable to compete with Cuban and Indian exports in the world system. And though a series of political eruptions from below had divided the land between large landowners, black and mulatto, and peasants, the majority of peasants were landless and frequently rebellious. Commercial pursuits and control of the administration of the state had increasingly become the arenas contended by the black and mulatto groups within the ruling class. But in this conflict, Alex Dupuy asserts the largely land-owning black factions and its allies, frustrated by the mulattoes in their attempt to control the state, had recourse to it's a black nationalist ideology. I don't know how to pronounce it. Noirste. No? Yeah. I said that right. Sometimes my brain. Or black nationalist ideology, claiming to be the sole representatives of the people because of their common skin color. Inevitably, during the second half of the century, a radical black ideology was articulated by renegades among the black petite bourgeoisie intelligentsia. Eventually, it was to mature in the work of Jean Price Mars, George Sylvain, and Carlos d'Ambrosio Martins. In every sector of the black world, the dialectic of exploitation would shake an increasing number to their very roots. And in time, as the fractures and contradictions of Western domination became more compelling, their presence and their purpose would become electrifyingly clear. Period. Next is Western civilization and the renegade black intelligentsia. Thanks for watching.